Hello and welcome to Pockenrop. In today's video I turn my attention to a band that I've been listening to for 30 years or so after I first heard their original compilation, Singles 45s and Under. It is Squeeze. Now Squeeze have been going for nearly 45 years, I think possibly even slightly longer, since the pairing of Difford and Tilbrook met, and to all intents and purposes it is effectively Chris Difford and Glenn Tilbrook with a changing array of side musicians, some of whom have become famous in their own right. As a result, Squeeze have released 14 albums, and then there's a 15th album called Difford and Tilbrook. I have taken the decision to include Difford and Tilbrook in my rundown because it gives me a nice neat 15, mainly because they themselves kind of include it as a Squeeze album. There was a great compilation came out in the 90s called Excess Moderation, and it contained 2 or 3 tracks from Difford and Tilbrook. Squeeze albums are quite hard to find these days. You can find vinyl copies in used record shops, but not every one of their CDs is actually widely available. I think several are deleted. I think it is high time that Squeeze grabbed hold of their back catalogue and did a full remastering extra tracks job on it. Before I dive in, I would remind you to like the video and hit the thumbs up, click the subscribe button and join our army of Pockenrop subscribers, or click the bell to receive notifications of future content as it's released weekly. At number 15, something has to come bottom of the list, and it's the most recent album from 2017, The Knowledge. I can honestly, hand on heart, say this is the one Squeeze album where I really don't like anything on it. I think maybe only Patchouli and Please Be Upstanding are all right. The melodies seem to lack. I don't think the lyrics are particularly great. And it's the melodies and the lyrics merge that make Difford and Tilbrook songs so memorable. It came from 2017. It's the most recent and by far the weakest. Maybe it could change with a few more listens, but I've really taken against this album. The one Squeeze album where I find very little, if anything, to actually enjoy, The Knowledge, at number 15. And number 14 is the album that I mentioned I was including, which rounded it out to 15. It's Difford and Tilbrook. It's not good. It's very 1984 production, but it does contain tracks that, if you tell me the title, I'll be able to hum it back at you, like Hope Fell Down and Action Speaks Faster and Love's Crashing Waves and The Apple Tree. It's not a good album by any stretch, but it's okay in places. Number 14, Difford and Tilbrook. At number 13, I've placed the final Squeeze album from the original existence of the group. It's Sweets from a Stranger from 1982. This album is full of missteps. Side 1 in particular is a honking calamity of a record until you come to the last track on that side, which is When the Hangover Strikes. However, side 2's got some very strong moments. Things like Elephant Ride, I've Returned, His House, Her Home, and Black Coffee in Bed, which is phenomenal. The peach of the collection is When the Hangover Strikes, which is a really great, affecting ballad and one of Squeeze's many tracks about the abuse of alcohol. Sweets from a Stranger, number 13. At number 12, I have placed 2015's Cradle to the Grave. This was an album that's kind of a soundtrack, but not a soundtrack, to a sitcom written by radio personality Danny Baker, which I think was called The Beautiful Game. There is a track called The Beautiful Game on the album. It's not wonderful. The album is perfectly fine throughout. There is nothing skippable, and there's maybe 3 standout tracks for me. There is Sunny, which is a very unusual tempo and style of track. I really enjoy listening to Sunny. Nirvana, which was really good fun, but The Peach is the title track from The Cradle to the Grave, which really stands head and shoulders above the rest of the record. As a result, once that track's gone, it's a bit of a downhill ride. Nothing wrong with Cradle to the Grave, but nothing really right about it either. Number 12, from the cradle to the grave. And number 11 is their debut album, UK Squeeze. This is a massively mixed bag. They took the production controls of 2 songs on there, one of which was Bang Bang, which is pretty awful. But the other is Take Me I'm Yours, which is a great single. And even now, I had an ex-girlfriend who referred to this as the camel song, mainly because of the line, I've come across the desert to greet you with a smile. My camel looks so tired, it's hardly worth my while. And she referred to this as the camel song. And I always think of that moment. We were going to see Glenn Tilbrook live in Sheffield University. But the album's a really, really mixed bag. You have got some great stuff like Strong in Reason, which I think is probably the first track that really stands out after the single. Out of Control, The Model, Take Me, I'm Yours, of course, First Thing Wrong, and Get Smart. These tracks in particular, whilst they're rough diamonds, they kind of hint at what great material Squeeze had still got to come. Number 11, UK Squeeze. And number 10, I've placed Ridiculous from 1995. This is too long. It's a 14-track album and it's a tiring listen. But there are several really fine songs on Ridiculous. Things like This Summer, which was released as a single twice and reached the top 30 twice. Heaven Knows and I Want You, which in many ways are almost exactly the same track, just a slightly rewritten in terms of melody. Temptation for Love's really good. Electric Train's often cited as one of Difford's greatest ever lyrics. I'm not as fond of it as some critics are. He did another version of it on his solo albums. And then Walk Away and Daphne. And Daphne in particular I think is a really, really nice track from Ridiculous. It's a bubbling under. If you've not heard Daphne, check it out. It's got a bit of an accordion on it, and I don't like accordion, but I do on a Squeeze track. Ridiculous, my number 10. Number 9, I have placed the very maligned Domino. This was the final Squeeze album for, 17 years, I believe. Domino is badly produced. Sorry, Glenn, you produced it. It sounds awful. But there are strong songs, in my opinion, littered throughout this album. The band themselves malign the album, say it shouldn't have been made. But I think the songs are better. The production lets them down. So I like, on this album, Play On, Bonkers, Domino, To Be a Dad, Moving Story, Without You Here, In the Morning, Little King, and I find Short Break, the very last track, really fun. It's the album that I actually saw Squeeze live twice after. So they played Birmingham, and it was a phenomenal concert. And then they played Wolverhampton about 2 weeks later, and I went a second time. And it's one of my most disappointing concerts because I would have expected a little bit more variation in the set list given how close Birmingham and Wolverhampton are to each other, but they did nothing to change it. Even to the point, there is a song on this album called Donkey Talk, which is crud. They played it, it was the walk off to the toilets for a pee song. They left it in. Donkey Talk, awful song. But Domino, great songs, horrible sound. At number 8, I have placed Squeeze's Return album. This was after they'd already split, and it's Cozy Fantuti. Now, when Squeeze first emerged, there was Difford, Tilbrook, a bassist called Harry Kukuli, Gilson Lavis on drums, who was with them for a very long time, and Jules Holland, whom you may have heard of. Now, Jules Holland left Squeeze to pursue a TV career. He was highly successful. He returned to Squeeze, and the resultant album was Cozy Fantuti Fruity. It's not a good album, okay? Very flawed in sound, very dated, but the return of Jules Holland gives it a spark that the previous album, Sweets from a Stranger, completely lacked. Some great songs on here. It's a 10-track album, and I love Last Time Forever, By Your Side, King George Street, I Learned How to Pray, No Place Like Home, and Cozy Fantuti Fruity, number 8. Crossing the halfway point, and we reach their third album, And this was the first album that began the trend of never releasing an album with the same official lineup twice. And it's rgbaji. So at this point, Harry Kukuli had left Squeeze. He didn't like the direction they were taking away from punk, more towards what they became known as kitchen sink dramas. And they brought in a fella called John Bentley. rgbaji is overrated. But it's overrated for a reason, and that is the first two tracks, which are Pulling Muscles from a Shell and Another Nail in My Heart, both of which are certainly Another Nail in My Heart is in my top 100 songs of all time. You may watch that video. Pulling Muscles would be in the top 200. I think they're both wonderful songs, and Pulling Muscles was the first song that really gripped me by Squeeze. You've then got Misadventure and Separate Beds, and that 4-song run is one of the strongest in 80s pop that I can think of. Far Feet's a Beat, Wrong Side of the Moon, and They're at the Top on Side B are really good, but the quality isn't maintained. And If I Didn't Love You, I find annoying. It's overrated, rgbaji, but it's got some really, really solid songwriting on it. Number 7. Number 6 is the album that you can see to my left, Babylon and On. Now, Babylon and On contains no bad track in my opinion, despite what Difford and Tilbrook say about 8535937. I think that's quite fun. But Babylon and On is polished, it's steady, it's consistent, and as a result, it's just that little bit boring. Hourglass was a great single, returned them back to the top 20, but everything else is competent. It's got the same problem for me that Cradle to the Grave has, which is everything is good, it's competent, it's consistent, it's not exciting. For me, the best track from the sessions, with the exception of Hourglass, is a track called Splitting into Three, about a family unit of 3 people breaking up. And it's kind of heartbreaking. It was a bonus track on the CD, but it was released on the B-side on a 12-inch. If they'd have popped that on there and maybe taken off 8535937, perhaps the album would have been that little bit stronger. Competent, consistent, just not stratospheric. Babylon and On at number 6. At number 5, I have placed their most famous song title. It's also the title of the album. It's Cool for Cats. Cool for Cats had 4 singles, and they were Goodbye Girl, Up the Junction, Cool for Cats, and Slap and Tickle. And only Slap and Tickle I think is a bit weak. That said, it's actually a pretty decent album. There's some questionable lyrics on there. It's somewhat sexist in some of those lyrics. Things like Me and This Bird, She's a Bit of All Right. Chris Difford was a little bit embarrassed about some of his early sexism in his lyrics, and we will come back to that topic a little bit later on when we talk about another song. The only poor thing on here I think is the knack, and I enjoy listening to Cool for Cats, and those highs of Goodbye Girl in particular, and especially Up the Junction, are redeeming some of the lesser tracks on there. Up the Junction in particular, fantastic song, no chorus, number 2 hit single. Great song, Up the Junction. And number 5, Cool for Cats. And number 4, I have placed Some Fantastic Place from 1993. This is a fine album with many strong songs on there. So it kicks off with Everything in the World. We've got Third Rail, which was a top 40 hit. Some Fantastic Place, which Difford and Tilbrook to this day still say is the strongest song they've ever written. I disagree, but it is a really good song. It's very personal to them, as it's about their friend Maxine, who without that person in their lives, there would be no Difford and Tilbrook. It's Over is a great single. Paul Carrack is on keys, which means that they get him to vocally sing Loving You Tonight. It won't be the last we hear about Paul Carrack. There's a contribution from Keith Wilkinson, who was their long-term bassist from Cozy, Fantuti Fruity, all the way through to the end of Ridiculous. Some Fantastic Place, my number 4. At number 3, I have placed the album that saw them dropped from the record label A&M due to poor sales. From 1989, it's Frank. This is hugely underrated as an album. I know the band themselves hold it in affection. They still play quite a lot of songs from it. But it didn't sell. It's not got a great cover. It sank without a trace, but it's a great Squeeze album. I think it's the best album that they recorded with Jools Holland in the band. It's his final farewell. He was clearly wanting to get out of Squeeze for the second time. But it's got great songs on it. Love Circles is the only duffer on there. I think it's boring, but everything else I thoroughly enjoy. So things like Slaughtered, Gutted and Heartbroken. There is She Doesn't Have to Shave, which is about his wife being doubled up in pain with a period pains. The opening hit single from it, well, I say hit, almost hit, If It's Love. And then there's Dr. Jazz, which more than anything else is Jools Holland's greatest contribution to the songs of Squeeze. He wrote it solely. It's a great song. They've been playing it live for years and they finally put it down onto wax for the Frank album. I think the Frank album is terrific. And it's my number 3. At number 2, I have placed the only album that they released as a 4-piece. So at this time, the band was Difford and Tilbrook, Keith Wilkinson and Gilson Lavis. It's his last album after he was dismissed for substance abuse. Such a strong album. Very complex. It's rich melodies, terrific lyrics. It's quite long. It's about 55 minutes long, so it's probably a bit too long for a vinyl album. Came from 1991. It was the album after Frank. I think this is possibly the only time in their career that they have released a great album followed by a great album. On here we'll find The Truth, which are the great ballads, The House of Love, which they dismiss as being doggerel, but is such good fun to listen to, Crying in My Sleep, Gone to the Dogs, Cupid's Toy, Wicked and Cruel, which is terrific, and the attempt at a hit single, which was Sunday Street, which is just really enjoyable to listen to. Consistently strong album, really hard to find. It's never been reissued. It was on the Reprise label rather than A&M. Remember I said they were dropped? This album is so close to being a perfect album. You have the question mark about what if Jools Holland had stayed and added the keyboard colour that he was so good at. And it really, really needs a significant issue. I said right up at the beginning of the video, it's about time that Squeeze took hold of their back catalogue and maybe did a really good, solid remastering job on it. Because I want play. I want play on vinyl. I want play with all of the extra tracks that were recorded around the same time, like Maidstone and Laughing in My Sleep. Grab hold of it. We need a reissue of the fantastic album Play. Which means that my number 1 is the only album I have yet to mention, which is their masterpiece, East Side Story. Jools Holland had left, go and pursue his TV career, and Paul Carrack was brought in on keyboards, and he adds so much. I still have the question mark over it. What if they'd still got Jools Holland on there? Also, there's a big what if this had been a double, as they had originally planned to do with 4 different producers. Now, the rumour was that it was going to be Elvis Costello, Nick Lowe, Dave Edmunds, and apparently the 4th side potentially produced by Paul McCartney. Now, ultimately, almost the entire album is produced by Elvis Costello. He does a fine job. It's one of his best production jobs, with the exception of In Quintessence, which is a Dave Edmunds production. Side A is a stunningly consistent album, from In Quintessence all the way through to Woman's World. Now, I said I'd return to the whole issue of sexist lyrics. Woman's World was Difford's attempt to write a lyric from the female viewpoint instead of all of those sexist ones he'd done in the past. And it's probably the best song on the album. Side 2 fails to keep up the quality of Side A. F-Hole is faintly annoying, but it does contain Labelled with Love, which was their 3rd and final top 10 hit. Even said, I think there's some missteps on the album. I don't dislike Mumbo Jumbo or Messed Around, but what I do find annoying is that the superlative Vanity Fair is sandwiched between the two. That track should have ended the album. To end the album on Vanity Fair would have been absolutely spot on. It contains some of his best lyrics. She comes home late with another screw loose and swears to have had just a pineapple juice. It's just poetry in motion. Fantastic album, East Side Story. It was really close to making my top 15 albums of the 1980s. My number one, East Side Story. So that concludes my rundown of 15 Squeeze albums. Ultimately, their best album isn't in the list, because that, for me, is Singles 45s and Under. I love their music, don't get me wrong, but they are one of the bands where their best album is their greatest hits album. So before I go, I just remind you to like the video, hit the subscribe, click the bell for notifications. I will at some point be doing a Tracks of My Years on Squeeze, but I always think it's a good idea to do an album ranking if it's appropriate before I go in and do the Tracks of My Years. I'll be back in a week with another video, but until then, thanks for watching.